This next workshop is Chemistry of Small Streams in the Upper Little Tennessee Basin, a complex story of biology, geology, and land use. We have two speakers for this from Coweta. Dr. Rhett Jackson from Coweta LTER is a professor of hydrology at the University of Georgia, whose research focuses on the effects of land use activities, specifically forestry, agriculture, and urbanization on water quality and aquatic habitat. And we have Dr. Jack Webster from Virginia Tech and Coweta LTER, who has been studying streams and watersheds at Coweta and in this area for 45 years, with research primarily on ecosystem processes in streams and stream modeling.
So when Bill McClarney talks about thinking about biodiversity in terms of what he sees in the streams versus what is expected in that stream, you know, that expectation is really based on forested conditions, because you live here in the Southern Appalachians in a landscape where if it weren't for human interference, it would be a forested ecosystem. So the aquatic species are adapted to cool water, shady streams, a lot of organic debris coming in, large woody debris. They're adapted to a system that would have had beavers in it. And so our expectation of what should live in these streams is really based on a forest. And one of the reasons we live here and people are attracted to this area is because it is so beautiful and the air is clean and the water seems clean. And the question is, in a system like this where most of the basins have more than 70% forest, what is the effect of relatively low amounts of forest conversion? So rural housing in the valleys, small farms, some commercial development along the main highways. What's the effect of that low level of development on stream habitat and water quality? So I'm going to sort of lay the groundwork for this talk. Jack Webster's going to come up and talk about chemistry, and then I'm going to come back and talk about how the aquatic habitat is different and how the species assemblages are different. So let's first think about the endpoint, urbanization. Let's think about a stream in Atlanta. Okay, so on one end of the spectrum we've got a forest, on the other end we've got downtown Atlanta. So why does urbanization make streams so bad? Well, one, you take the soil, you take off the trees, you compact the soil, you reduce the storage, you make it harder for water to get into the storage and into the soil. You build roads and parking lots that the water runs off during storms. We over-fertilize our lawns and we put pesticides on the lawns. And it turns out that we end up with streams that go up and down much more during storms. The peak flows get much higher. The channel erodes more. You've got higher levels of nutrients, higher levels of toxins. And if you look at the bottom left figure, you see that the observed biological potential goes down with how much urbanization is in the watershed. This is well known. And we kind of have this threshold that people in the urban hydrology literature throw around of about 10% impervious surface is a amount of development at which you start to see negative effects on the aquatic ecosystem. Well, a lot of these basins around here, we have much less than 10%. We're way below these thresholds that we tend to associate with problems in urban systems. So what do we see here? I'm going to use a word here that isn't commonly used, exurbanization. And so one of the things that goes on around here is we have this exurbanization, which is the movement of people to a region for reasons other than employment. So over the last 30 years, a lot of development in this region is second home development, and it's retirees who've moved here, and they've moved here for some reason other than employment. So we have this sort of traditional development you see on the left where people live on the valleys, not right next to the stream, but on the edge of the valleys. The hill slopes are usually forested. But over the last 30 years, we also start to see what you see on your right, which is some housing developments going up in the hills, places where historically people didn't live around here. So this motivates this question: what are the water quality and habitat effects of these low levels of rural development and exurbanization? And to that point, here's some of the streams we study. You see the stream names on the bottom. The green bar is how much of these basins are forested. And so even these basins that we kind of think of as our developed basins, places like Bates Branch and Watauga Creek and Hemlock Hills, there's still 70% or more forest. You know, if I were working on an urban system, these would be my reference streams. But here are the streams that we're looking at. Okay. So Jack and I are going to run through studies that we've done with the Coweta LTER over about the last 10 or 12 years. Some of these studies were referred to as the Synoptic Studies, where we originally took a sort of a snapshot of stream conditions over the whole upper Little Tennessee. So on your right, you see a map, and all those little black triangles are stream segments where we did these studies. And then we did more focused studies. We picked 9 small watersheds and 3 big river systems that you see on your right, on your left, and we instrumented those watersheds pretty intensively and monitored them for about 18 months and looked more closely at the water chemistry and water quality conditions in those streams. Now that map on your left also shows you how much precipitation varies over this region. So one thing everybody knows about this region is it rains a lot. But what you might not realize is it rains a lot more in some places than in others. So if you live up in Cowie or Kaler, you get about 50% less rainfall than they get at the Coweta Hydrologic Lab. You still get a lot of rain, but the Coweta Hydrologic Lab gets a lot more. And so one of the things that you're dealing with in this template is that the streams themselves, just due to their natural hydroclimate variability, are really different in terms of how much rain they get and how they behave. And so one of the things that's unusual about this area is that there is so much variation in the behavior of these streams, even without humans. So this is a typical land use distribution around here. This is Skeena Creek, South Fork Skeena Creek. And what you see is this pattern that we usually see, with trees up on the hill slopes and most people and most of the residences and the small farms right down in the valley. And with Exce urbanization, you see these different land use patterns. So this is Watauga, and you guys are mostly familiar with Watauga, and you see the black lines of the road networks. And here in Watauga, you see a lot more development that's high up in the hills, and you've got roads high up. One of the ways that we look at this is by looking at the watersheds from their sides. So each one of these dots on this map is basically from the digital elevation map. It's a 30 by 30 meter pixel. And each one of these pixels is coded in color by what its land use is. So the greens are forests, and the reds are some type of built environment. And the x-axis is the hydrologic distance to the outlet. It's how far you'd have to flow from that pixel to get to the outlet of the watershed. And the y-axis is the normalized elevation. It's how high you are from the bottom of that watershed relative to the distance to the top of the watershed. And so this is from sideways how these two different types of basins look. So Skeena Creek on your left, you see the reds all sort of at the bottom of the watershed. And Watauga's on the right, where the red's going much higher in the watershed. So we have these two very different types of watersheds that we look at. What we call these mountainside watersheds, where some of the development is well up in the watershed, and what we call sort of the valley development, where everything that's developed is kind of at the bottom of the valley. So with that setting, Jack's going to lead you through a discussion of chemistry in these streams.
Okay, so let's get down to the good stuff. We're going to get down to the chemistry in these streams. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology, geology, a little bit about climate, and the land use, by which I mean the human effects on the chemistry in these streams. So we're going to talk about these 4 factors. But one of our themes is going to be that we can't look at these independently. That there are a lot of interactions among these. And you'll see this as we're going through that. So let's start off by saying what chemicals are we looking at, have we been looking at? We look at a lot of kinds of nitrogen. We look at nitrate, ammonium, dissolved organic nitrogen, and various anions here. Now notice that these are ions. When I say phosphorus, I'm not talking about elemental phosphorus. I'm talking about phosphate. And when I talk about chloride, I'm talking about chloride, not chlorine, not the element chlorine, but chloride. And then we've got lots of cations. If you like to think about where these are in the periodic table, there they are, but you probably don't want to do that. But really we're going to concentrate, or I'm going to use examples, 4 examples. We're going to talk a lot about nitrate, one example of chloride, a little bit about calcium and magnesium. Where do these things come from? Where do these chemicals come from? Well, some of them are in the rainfall, particularly chloride and sodium. Of course, they come from the ocean, they get into the air, and so we get lots of chloride and sodium that way. Sulfate is in precipitation also, and some nitrate. Other chemicals come from the weathering of bedrock. So things like our cations here particularly come from weathering of bedrock. But then we've also got human activities, which can bring in things like nitrate, phosphate, chloride. We'll talk about where these things come from in a little while. But these human activities also affect what comes in as precipitation. A lot of our sulfate and nitrate that comes in is coming from power plants and from automobile exhausts. And we'll see how human activities can also affect weathering, weathering of these cations. So let's start with geology. What we're looking at here is samples of calcium and magnesium, calcium up here, magnesium down here, concentrations that we measured in a stream at Coweta, so a mostly forested watershed, over a period of nearly 2 years. And so the black dots here, and you're going to see a lot of graphs like this, so we'll try and keep up with it. The black dots here are the concentration of calcium taken when it wasn't raining, and then these red dots are where we sampled a storm. We sampled 6 storms. There are actually 2 of them right there that were taken right back to back over the space of that 2-year period. And what you see with calcium is the concentration goes up in the summer. So the green bars are summer, the white bars are winter. Concentration generally goes up in the summer, and then it drops during the winter, and then it comes back up again. And you see that magnesium does almost exactly the same thing, doesn't it? Okay, it comes up in the winter, goes down in the summer. And if we take those data, now these are exactly the same data, just plotted differently. So I've got magnesium over here, calcium down here, plotted against each other. The black dots are taken when it's not raining, and the red numbers now are the storms. And what you see is they fall pretty much in a straight line, don't they? Okay, so that the ratio of magnesium to calcium is nearly always the same. And that's true for any stream we sample. So here's the data we were just looking at, Ball Creek, here's Jones Creek, Cowie Creek. These are the ones that Rhett was showing us there, Bates Branch, Skeena, Ray, Kaler, Watauga. And you see in nearly every case, all these data, whether it's a storm or not during a storm, they're right in that same straight line, aren't they? And we can put these all together. So these are the same thing, but this is just all the streams separately. The Ball Creek is right down in here somewhere. Here's Jones Creek on here. And here's Watauga Creek there. Each stream is on a line, isn't it? Okay, and they generally follow the same line, but not exactly. And this is because there are differences in the chemistry of the bedrock in these different areas. So the chemistry here at Kaler Fork is a little bit different than in Jones Creek. Okay, but you know, the magnesium and calcium are coming from the same place. They're coming from weathering, but it's just a little bit of different chemistry there. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that different watersheds have different geology, but it's also telling us that something about human accelerated weathering. So you see that most of the green dots, those are the forested watersheds, are down in here, aren't they? Okay, and then we have the brown ones, which are the mixed agriculture and developed. Most of those are watersheds that have development along the stream, down in the valley, traditional valley development. And then the red ones are more up, whoops, not very good with this mouse here, are up in here. Those are the more developed watersheds. And we see as we go from the forested up here, things get higher. So that's human accelerated weathering. Now we have some things that don't fit very well, don't we? This is Hemlock Hills down in here. That's a little stream up in the headwaters of Crawford Branch, right here in Franklin, but up there to the west in Franklin. The blue is also in stream. That's Crawford Branch. That's that little stream right out here that drains all of Franklin. This is what Crawford Branch looks like. And we'll see the black dots, you know, they generally follow a straight line here, don't they? But look what happens during storms. They're not on the same line, are they? They're on a different line, which is saying the ratio of calcium and magnesium is different during a storm than it is when it's not raining. So here's Franklin. We're down in here somewhere, over here, and Crawford Branch drains all of this area. This is what Crawford Branch looks like just about a quarter mile up that way. And you can see it here at low flow. But what happens when we have a storm? That water gets up into here, doesn't it? And it is weathering a different kind of rock. It's weathering concrete. And where does that concrete come from? Well, it's what, calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate. We don't have any of that around here. We don't have sources of that around here. So that concrete has come from somewhere else, and it has a slightly different calcium to magnesium ratio in it. In fact, it has relatively more calcium. Well, is that important? Probably not. It's interesting, to me it's interesting anyway, and it shows how what we are doing, human development, land use, can affect some of the chemistry of streams. Let's look at something very different. Let's look at chloride. Now you see this pattern of chloride over this 2-year period is really flat, isn't it? You know, the calcium did, what did it do? It went, no, it went the other way, didn't it? It went down in the summer and up in the winter, something like it. But we see that the chloride is just pretty much flat. And what happens during storms? Well, calcium went up during storms, but we see that chloride goes down during storms. So chloride behaves very differently than calcium. Well, where does our calcium come from? It comes primarily from rainfall. We don't get any chloride from weathering. There are places in the country where you get chloride from weathering, but we don't around here. It comes from rainfall. So we can calculate how much chloride comes into a watershed. We take how much rain it rains, what's the concentration of chloride in that rainfall, multiply those together, and we get the total amount in, which in this case, this year, was 44.7 kilograms per hectare per year. And the same way we can calculate how much goes out. We measure stream flow, we measure the chloride concentration in that stream flow, multiply them together, and in that year we came up with 3.7. Now to me, those numbers are very similar. Okay? I know where the errors might be involved in that, so I say those are pretty similar. Here are those two numbers, 4.7 in, 3.7 out, so export is 80% or 0.8 of what's coming in. And if we look at all these more or less forested watersheds, we see that the numbers over here are pretty close to 1. Some of them are a little bit lower than 1. If you're up in the Kaler Fork area, Micah City area, where you get less rainfall, the numbers are a little less than 1. But they're close. We go down here to the mixed agriculture and developed, still pretty close to 1, not far off. But look what happens when we get down into these more developed watersheds. Particularly, we get to Watauga Creek. There is 6 times more export of chloride than there is coming in as rainfall. And in Crawford Branch, 4 times as much. So there's a lot more chloride going out than's coming in. Where's that coming from? Well, we didn't mention these, but septic systems, leaky sewers, road salt, fertilizer. So we've got lots of human sources of this chloride that's coming out there. So as you can see, I've already, I'm trying to keep these things separate, just talk about geology, but you can see how I've already transitioned into land use effects and how that's affecting chemistry. So let's go to that. Let's think about land use and how it affects calcium concentration, for example. So again, here are all these 17 streams that we've been studying. The green ones are the mostly forested. This is the calcium concentration. Here, calcium concentrations are pretty low, except at Willis Cove, which is interesting, has fairly high calcium. Here are our mixed watersheds, generally somewhat higher, and then here are red streams with higher calcium concentration, except for Hemlock Hills. We've also already noted that that has, for some reason, low calcium and magnesium concentrations. But you can see the general trend there, and we can plot those data another way. Again, this is calcium concentration. This is the percent forest land cover. So here are the mostly forested, the green ones down here. Here's Willis Cove up here, it falls out. Here are most of the brown streams, let's call them. And then here's Crawford Branch and Watauga Creek and Bates Branch up in here. Okay, more interesting. Let's get to nitrate concentration. Same thing, and we can see a huge thing here. And here's nitrate, really, really low in the green ones. Get in the brown ones, it's higher. And the red ones, it gets even higher. And Hemlock Hills is not separate there. It has the kind of nitrate concentration that we would expect there. So here's another graph of that same data, nitrate concentration versus the forest land cover. And you see we don't have to lose much forest land cover before nitrate concentrations start going up. Moving on to biological effects. Yeah, we have trees on these watersheds. Those trees affect water chemistry. But I'm not going to talk about those much because I'm more interested in what happens in streams. And so we're going to talk about the biology that goes on in these streams, the in-stream biological processes, and we're going to concentrate mostly on nitrate. So you've seen this graph before. This was calcium concentration that did something like that. We saw chloride that did something like that. And now here's nitrate. And we'll see it stays pretty constant during the winter. And these are all, this is a forest stream at Coweta. Goes up a lot in the summer and then comes down in late summer and then just goes essentially to almost nothing here in the fall. And then it's constant during the winter, goes up in the summer and comes down again. Comes down a lot. So nitrate's behaving very differently. So nitrate cycle is very complicated, and we're not going to talk about all these details, okay? We're going to talk about just 3 processes: microbial uptake, algal uptake or plant uptake, and mineralization. So if you go to a little forest stream at Coweta or anywhere around here in the fall, you'll find it's full of leaves. And what's happening on those leaves, how they're affecting nitrate, is something called microbial uptake. So those leaves contain a very small amount of nitrogen, let's say 0.2%. But this little bacteria, or maybe it's a fungi, I can't tell, that's growing on these leaves contains 2% nitrogen. So as it grows and it's getting its carbon from that leaf, it's not getting enough nitrogen from that leaf, is it? So it has to get its nitrogen somewhere else. So it takes nitrogen out of the water. So we call that the microbial uptake, the nutrient uptake by bacteria and fungi that are eating that leaf. Now we go to a different kind of stream. This stream isn't around here, fortunately. But we do have streams that have some algae in them. That was all algae growing on those rocks there. But we do have some thin film of algae here. This is supposed to be a rock, and that green line is the film of algae growing on that rock. And here's a giant diatom, which is a kind of algae. They photosynthesize, don't they? They get their carbon by photosynthesis, by taking carbon dioxide and sunlight and growing. But in order to grow, they also need these other chemicals. They need silica, or diatoms need silica. They need nitrogen. They need phosphorus. And where are they going to get it? They get it out of the water. Whoops, there we go. So this is algal uptake, where they are taking this out of the water. So here's microbial uptake. That's the area of the leaves, they're decomposing, they're the microbes taking nitrate out of the water. Here's the algae, that's that green film there. They're taking nitrate out of the water. But then when those bacteria and fungi and those algae, when they die, that nitrogen is released back into the water. We call that mineralization. And that eventually results in the nitrate getting back into the stream. Well, what's interesting about these processes then, microbial uptake, algal uptake, and mineralization, is they go on at different times of the year. So, if we look at a small forested stream, this Ball Creek again at Coweta, we're looking at nitrate, and we've already seen this where it goes way up, and then it comes way down. What's causing that? That's that microbial uptake, isn't it? That's right after the leaves fall in the stream, and those microbes growing on this need nitrate, need nitrogen, so they're taking it out of the water. Nitrogen concentrations go almost down to zero. And if we had another point on here, we'd see that going down to zero the next year, too. But if we go to a stream like this is Skeena Creek, which gets quite a bit of sunlight. At least it gets a lot of sunlight in the winter when there aren't leaves on the tree, and in the spring, we see a different pattern, that the concentrations will typically go down right in here. Let me see it better this year. That during the late winter, when there's no leaves on the trees, and then the late winter and the spring, when it starts warming up, the algae in that stream will take up nitrogen. We'll get algal uptake, and so we get minimum concentrations here in the spring. And there are also some leaves in the stream, so we get another minimum here in the fall. So we get a period, we get a pattern that shows two minimum. And then if we go to Crawford Branch, we see very little change in the concentrations. It does come down a little bit in the winter, stays pretty constant through the summer. That year is pretty constant, maybe down a little bit. But if we compare those three, here's Crawford Branch, pretty constant. Here's Skeena with 2 periods of minimum there. And then here's Ball Creek with the real strong minimum there. Well, what's happening in Crawford Branch? Why aren't we seeing more change there? Well, look at the concentrations. You know, here we're dealing with concentrations that go, they're around 0.04. Here they're around 0.1. If we look at them here, they're around 0.5. So maybe 10 times higher here than here. So there's so much nitrogen in Crawford Branch that the biological processes going on there don't have any real effect on it, the in-stream biological process. Now, I disagree a little bit with Bill, who said these are sterile streams. There's a lot of biology going on. There might not be any fish in there, but there are microbes in there. There is algae in there, but they aren't doing much that affects the water chemistry because it's so hot.
I was only talking about the entubed portions. I was talking about the entubed portions.
Yeah, you get in one of those tunnels. Yeah, well, there's still some microbes in there, but yeah, they're not very much interesting in there, that's for sure. Okay, so we see 3 different patterns of nitrate concentration. The 4 streams, which really go low here in the fall. A stream with mixed, which is low in the fall and low in the spring. And then a stream like Crawford Branch, which doesn't show a lot of dynamics. Moving on a little bit to talk about a little bit about terrestrial effects on chemistry. We did an experiment down at Coweta that started in 1977 when we logged Watershed 7. This is an experimental logging, and if you want to know a lot about it, there's a whole book on it. I saw a copy out there on the desk that Jason had out there. And we saw that it had effects on how much water came out of that watershed. So what we're looking at on this graph is from 1960s all the way up till about 2015. We're looking how much the discharge or the flow in the stream changed. So this was the calibration period. Okay, so we see some up and downs, a little bit of variability in the years, but it's varying around 0 there. And then after we cut the trees down, the discharge went way up. You cut down the trees, the discharge didn't go up, because trees are a big user of water, aren't they? and you eliminate the trees, you don't have that use of water, so the water goes down the stream. So we got a big increase in discharge, but that recovered after about 10 years, and we went along here where it was variable, but varying around 0. But look what's happened more recently is that the discharge has decreased. The relative discharge has decreased. Okay? Because there are different kinds of trees there now than there were back here. And what's happened to the nitrate in this stream? Here's pre-logging. Here's what happened when we logged it. The nitrate concentration went way up. We expected that. And then it started to recover. Okay, and it was recovering nicely for about 10 years, and then it went up again. And then it went up again. And then it came down. And then it went up again. And then it came down some. We don't know, these data end in 2013. I haven't looked at what's happening now. But there's a lot of variability there. And what's causing that variability? We think it has a lot to do with this, Robinia pseudoacacia, or black locust. This is the tree composition in that watershed before logging, all the way up to 2010 or so. And you can see before logging, it was made up of basically oaks, hickories, here's some more oaks, maple, birch. But of course, those were all cut down. And what grew up immediately was black locust. And you can see it has now gone down, or relatively down. Now what's mainly there is tulip poplar, yellow poplar. But what's significant about black locust is it has special cells on the roots that contain a bacteria that fixes nitrogen. That is, it takes nitrogen out of the air, elemental nitrogen, and converts it into usable nitrogen. That then is the source, we think, of all this nitrogen. So these red dots are the ones we saw before, where the nitrogen went up, started down, and then it's gone up and down. And basically, it continuing to increase. We think that main source of that nitrogen is from nitrogen fixation by the black locust symbionts. Now, also on this graph, though, I've showed this blue line is the discharge. Now, this is not the relative discharge. This is the actual discharge in the stream. And we can see we had a period of drought here in the late 80s. I remember that. Some of you may remember that. And then we recovered for a while. Then we had another drought, late 90s, recovered, and then another drought here in, 2005, 2008, in that period. And those gray bars are those droughts. And you can see how the nitrogen follows those droughts. So here where we had a drought, the red dots are down in here. We recover from that drought, the red dots go up. Another drought, and the red dots are down. Then they go up. Another drought, and the red dots are going down. So there's something to do with climate and the nitrate concentration. I don't know if I can explain it. So, I was going to talk about these 4 things and how they affected water chemistry. We saw how that was affected by land use. Land use affects biology. It affects what the trees and the shading and what kind of organisms are in the stream. It affects the weathering rates. We could get a lot more complicated. We could talk about how climate affects land use, how climate affects biology. We could get a whole lot more complicated than this. But I've run out of time, so I won't get any more complex. I'm going to let Rhett take over again, and then he'll be up here to answer the questions.
We're both going to answer the questions. So, Jack just gave you a good overview of some of the chemical differences that we see in some of these streams. And the big one that you need to take home is this idea that nitrogen is a lot higher in both the rural and the more developed streams. And the nitrogen acts as essentially a fertilizer for the stream system. Now I'm going to talk about some other things that are different about the streams. And first I'm going to talk about things that are different because riparian conditions are different. So we can think about things that happen at the watershed, and we can think about things that happen right next to the stream. And so, bottom right here, you see sort of a typical Southern Appalachian stream with an overstory, and then in this case, a rhododendron understory. And then in your bottom left, you can see a stream where the farmer has left some trees next to the stream, and then you can see at the top some streams where we've basically removed all the trees. Well, this has 2 really big effects. One, you can probably guess, is temperature. I'll get to that in a second. But one is also just on the channel form itself. So one of the things you can think about those riparian trees is doing is they're moderating a lot of things about the microclimate of the stream, but also the structure of the stream. They're changing the roughness of the stream, and they're changing whether light hits, they're adding organic debris. And so when we go from a system with a lot of trees to the system you see pictured there, you end up with a stream that's very different. One of the ways it's different is that the stream becomes a lot narrower. So the x-axis here is a variable that we think should predict how wide the channel is. So the channel should get bigger as the basin gets bigger, so as drainage area goes up. And the channel should get narrower the steeper the basin is. So these green squares up here are all forested streams with forested riparian zones. So that's how wide the channel should be for a given value of the channel width predictor. These open red squares here are streams that have grass or pasture riparian zones. And so what you see is the channels are dramatically narrower when we go from a forested riparian zone to a grass riparian zone. So if you think about it as like habitat space for fish or for amphibians, you actually have a smaller, simpler stream as a result of taking the forest off. You also get a much warmer stream. So there was a question earlier about stream temperatures. So I'm going to show you a couple graphs here, summer 2010 and summer 2011. The blue streams time series, this is like for 2 weeks in August when it's hot. And the blue time series are time series of water temperatures from forested streams. Sort of the brownish ones are streams that have valley development, and the darker the color is, so red is Crawford Branch. And you can see there's a dramatic difference in the summertime stream temperatures. The maximum temperatures are 2 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer, and the diurnal variation, how much it goes up and down each day, is much greater. And this is true even in streams that aren't very developed, that basically just have the valley development. We see this in each summer, and I'm only showing you about 9 streams here, but this is a theme that just is recurrent. The way I talk about this is if you're thinking about a lot of the valley streams around here, climate change happened 100 years ago. When we took the riparian forest off of these streams got much warmer, and that's going to have a big biological effect. So the other thing is even though we have relatively low amounts of development in these streams, a lot of the disturbance is near the streams. So where we are doing the small farms, it's near the streams. And a lot of our roads up the small streams are gravel roads, and they have open ditches next to the roads, and they produce a lot of sediment. And one of the things we see is a big increase in total suspended sediments. So TSS is total suspended solids, and we're describing it in milligrams per liter. This is a scientist's axis here. It's a log scale. So when we go from 10 to 10 to the 1 to 10 to the 2, each time we're going up by a factor of 10. So here are the TSS distributions for our forested streams. And so the way these plots work, that's what we call a box plot. The bottom of the box is the 25th percentile, the top of the box is the 75th percentile, the line through the middle of the box is the median, and those whiskers are the 10th and 90th percentile. So it's a way of showing the whole distribution of values that we measured. So we go to these valley streams, and now the median concentrations are about 2 to 3 times what they were in the forested streams. And the mountainside development streams, they're 4 or 5 times greater, and that persists all the way down through the river sites. So one of the things that we've done to these streams is we've made them have higher nitrogen concentrations. We've given them more sediment in the streams, and we've made them a lot warmer. In the interest of time and complication, I'm going to skip this slide. All right. So one of the things that we've studied are biological conditions in these streams, and this is, we had a student, Kristen Scala, who looked at amphibian populations in these streams and what amphibians were there. And for the 2 species that she was looking at, the y-axis here is the probability that you're going to find that salamander in that stream. And what I want you to see, the x-axis here is a proportion of the catchment that's forest. So if the forest is 80 or 90% forest, we have a real high probability of finding the salamander species in the stream. But just down to 70% or less, that probability goes way down. Now there's also elevation is a big thing. So kind of getting to Jack's point about the chemistry is affected by climate, geology, and land use. The biology is also affected by things other than land use. So we're going to see a strong land use signal in all these biological conditions, but there's also some sort of natural signal here. So these salamanders like to be at higher elevations. Here is data from fish surveys done by Jim Peterson and Joe Kirsch. And so again, here is the percent of endemic species. So that of the fish that they found, how many of them were native endemics? And the x-axis here is urban land cover. So again, relatively small amounts of urban land cover are associated with a big drop in the percentage of endemic species. And so this is intolerant species, species that don't like development really, and they tend to be at higher elevations. So one of the things that Bill McClarney talked about was brook trout. Well, brook trout like to be high up in the system and they like to be in cold water. So again, what we found here is a strong land use signal, but there's also a underlying natural signal of variability in these streams. So a student named John Frisch, basically, because we can't look at everything, he looked at sort of 4 reference taxa. He looked at a shredding stonefly called Talaperla. He looked at an insectivorous fish that lives on the bottom of the channel called Codus. He looked at an omnivorous crayfish called Cambarus. And he looked at this little shredding, grazing snail that lives on the algae. And, oh, this got messed up a little bit. So, for example, the stonefly had a strong relationship to forest, but it also had a strong relationship to total dissolved nitrogen. The sculpin, again, had a strong relationship to forest, but it also liked streams that had coarse substrate, big rocks. The crayfish was really negatively associated with agriculture. Like streams with more agriculture is less likely to be there. But it was very positively associated with large woody debris. So again, if you had better riparian conditions, you were more likely to find it. So again, what I'm saying, in each of these cases, there's a strong land use effect, but there's also some other strong effect that's more about the watershed. So to conclude, moderate amounts of forest conversion around here, less than 35%, has been associated with much higher sediment, higher dissolved inorganic nitrogen, really narrow and simple channels without wood, elevated stream temperatures, and highly altered biological assemblages. So even these relatively low amounts of development have been associated with significant changes in water quality. And a lot of those changes could be mitigated, or we could improve water quality quite a bit by just improving the near stream practices. You can't really read this, but I'm going to talk about it in our redesign of the slides in the last couple of days. One of the things we found, and Bill talked about this a little bit, is that sometimes you find weird things next to the stream. You find people who put their compost heap in the stream. You find pipes. They were talking about the straight piping earlier. Pipes that just come out in the stream with no apparent reason. We find a certain farmer who tends to throw the cow patties in the stream. Now, as scientists, we don't like to report people because we rely on people to allow us to come to their streams. So we don't want to narc on them after they've given us permission to use their streams. But along the way, we just kept notes. There are a lot of weird things that people do next to streams. And I think that a lot of things could be, a lot of water quality conditions around here could be improved through relatively simple actions and improving riparian conditions that without a whole lot of effort and a whole lot of lifestyle change, we could make some of these smaller streams a lot better. Thank you. I know it's almost lunchtime, but we will take questions.
Is there an education program for when you see some of these things in streams that you can educate farmers or owners
So one of the beauties of the Coweta Hydrologic Lab and the Coweta LTER is that some of our employees are also residents here and are involved in things like the Mainsprings Land Trust and other organizations. And what we kind of really hope, and it does work out that way, is that they take some of the things that Jack and I do as scientists and they translate them to actions on the ground. So that is working, but that's kind of how it does. We don't do it ourselves. There's another question there. Yeah.
I was curious about the Department of Transportation's changing the use of salt from rock salt to brine. Have you tracked any of that? Is that hitting the water?
No, that's a really good question. And so one of the things that Jack didn't really talk about is that we puzzle about some of the watersheds where we do have a lot higher sodium and chloride concentrations. Watauga is one of those, for example. And we don't feel like we have enough data to figure out which of these streams are getting salted a lot and which ones aren't. So right now, we're just puzzled by all that.
The first samples we took from Watauga Creek were taken in the winter, and we saw the real high chloride concentration. We thought, oh yeah, there's salt in the roads. It was just a week after there had been a snowstorm. Took samples that summer, they were high again. They were relative to the other streams. So it's not just road salt, that there's other mechanisms that salt's getting into streams. Yeah.
Question about, live on a county road, and over time, on the edge of the road, these berms have built up. So when it rains, the road becomes like an open channel. And it seems to me a lot more sediment is flowing down that road, and all of a sudden it hits a spot and it goes shooting into the branch. About 5-6 years ago, I believe the county came by with a road grader, scraped that berm off, which I think would allow the water to gently flow off the road, through the grass. Sediment would settle out before it goes in the branch. Am I kind of right here?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things you can do to mitigate the sediment coming from roads, but one of the troubles is with the Southern Appalachians is that steep unpaved roads are going to produce a lot of sediment regardless. And there are things you can do with sediment traps and with what we call relief ditches on to disperse that road runoff. But road runoff in a steep environment is a problem. And steep unpaved roads are going to produce a lot of sediment. That is an interesting story, though, you told about the berm, because it sounds like it had
Well, it's a paved road.
Right.
Okay.
But that berm...
And like I said, 5 or 6 years ago, they came by and scraped that off, hauled it away somewhere. But now, over time, you've got branch roads that are unpaved.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, they carry that sediment down there, and those berms start building up again. And I'm just wondering if those berms went away, would it be better to allow that sediment to settle out on the grass before it goes into the stream?
Well, so that's essentially what you want to do, is you want to have places where you can divert that road runoff into relatively flat, vegetated areas and get it to disperse before it goes into the stream in concentrated form. If you're approaching the stream sort of at a hard angle and the stream and this road's coming down steeply, it's really hard to do that. But there are a lot of things you can do with road engineering to try and reduce the amount of sediment that delivers from the road to the stream. Yeah.
Kind of a dumb question, not a dumb question, but a simple question. Is it an oversimplification to say that the single most important thing we could do to enhance the health of our aquatic systems would be to upgrade and increase the amount of riparian cover on our streams?
I think encouraging riparian reforestation would help a lot. I think working with the county road and state road systems to reduce sediment delivery would help a lot. I think making sure that septic standards are enforced on new development would help a lot. Some of the weird things we see are in places where it seems like a lot of houses are built right next to the stream. So I'll give you an example. Why a branch is a stream that should be really clean, but it's got some weird chemistry. And I think it's because a lot of those houses are right on the stream, and there's really not room for their septic systems to work.
Interestingly, I don't think that would change nitrate very much, because nitrate seems to come from the whole watershed,
Yeah.
and not from just that riparian area. But I'm not sure that's the important thing we're really after.
Can you give people some context for the Clean Water Act and what nitrate levels are regulated at, and put your values in context to that?
Okay, so the Clean Water Act has concentrations of nitrogen that at 10 milligrams per liter as a health hazard, but that's really based on human health. Because if you're drinking water with more than 10 milligrams per liter nitrate, it affects pregnant women. They give birth to babies have what are called blue baby syndrome. The environmental effects of nitrogen, though, are much more contextual, and the Clean Water Act doesn't really regulate it. But I will say that all the levels that we're talking about around here are well below the Clean Water Act standard. So we're talking about ecological effects of nitrogen at levels that are well below what would be human health levels.
By an order of magnitude.
Yes.
Like most of the things they
That's
presented
correct.
are in the part per billion range instead
Right.
of the 10 part per million.
That's correct.
We have really clean water here.
Right. I mean, relative to human health, the nitrogen is insignificant, right? What we're talking about is as an environmental or ecological concern. Yeah.
What are the current regulations for the farmer allowing cows into a stream?
People ask that question a lot, as a matter of fact. It's actually legal to have cows in the stream. It's not when they start causing major problems in the stream. Then some regulation can happen on that. I don't know the extent of that, but that's probably the most common question our forest keeping department has had.
Does that affect the nitrogen content of the metal stream?
I'm certain it does, but I don't have the science to tell.
Probably affects the sediment concentration much more.
Yeah, the sediment definitely much more, but very definitely our water quality, that's a huge thing. And the good thing is that there are grants to help pay for fencing, just to keep them out. So a lot of farmers use that, take advantage of that when they learn about it.